It was a quiet Tuesday morning in early September when Queen Camilla started preparing for her trip to Scotland. The palace was buzzing with its usual activity, but something felt different that day. The staff members who had worked with her for years noticed she wasn't quite herself. She kept checking her bags over and over again, something she never usually did. Her personal assistant watched as Camilla zipped and unzipped her handbag 3 times in just 10 minutes. This wasn't normal behavior for the queen consort, who was usually so composed and organized. The staff exchanged glances but said nothing. After all, working in the palace meant knowing when to stay quiet. What made everyone even more curious was Camilla's sudden decision about the security team. Royal trips always came with a full security detail, photographers, assistants, and a whole team of people. But that morning, Camilla insisted she wanted to keep things simple. She told the chief of security that she only needed a small group with her. Some staff members wondered if she was trying to avoid attention, but from whom and why? The drive to Heathrow Airport was unusually quiet. Camilla sat in the back of the royal car, staring out the window at the London streets passing by. Her fingers kept touching a worn leather handbag that sat on her lap. It was old, the kind of bag that had seen many years of use. The leather was soft and faded in places, very different from the expensive designer bags she usually carried to public events. When they arrived at the private terminal at Heathrow, a few photographers were already waiting. They always knew when royals were traveling. The cameras started clicking as soon as Camilla stepped out of the car. Usually she would smile and wave, maybe stop for a quick word with the press. But not today. Today she walked quickly, her head slightly down, that leather handbag clutched tightly against her chest. One of the photographers later told his editor that something seemed off. He had been covering the royal family for 15 years and had never seen Queen Camilla look so distracted. In all his photos, she wasn't looking at the cameras. Her eyes seemed focused on something far away, or maybe on something deep inside her own thoughts. Inside the private terminal, things should have gone smoothly. This was a space designed for royals and VIPs, where everything was handled with care and discretion. The staff there had checked in everyone from prime ministers to Hollywood stars. They knew how to make travel easy and stress-free for important people. But as Camilla walked through the elegant waiting area, she kept switching the handbag from one arm to the other. Her personal aide reached out to carry it for her, as was customary. The aide had carried the queen's belongings 100 times before. But Camilla pulled the bag back quickly, almost protectively. She smiled and said she preferred to keep it with her. The aide stepped back, confused and a little hurt. The security officers noticed this too. It was their job to notice everything. Royal protection wasn't just about stopping threats from outside. It was also about understanding when something wasn't quite right, when patterns changed, when behavior seemed unusual, and everything about this trip seemed unusual. As they approached the security screening area, even in the private terminal everyone had to go through checks, Camilla's pace slowed down. She took a deep breath before stepping up to the security checkpoint. The officer there was a woman who had been doing this job for 8 years. She had screened hundreds of VIPs and had learned to be both respectful and thorough. The usual procedure was simple. Bags went through the scanner, people walked through the metal detector, and everything was done within minutes. But when Camilla placed her handbag on the conveyor belt, her hand lingered on it for just a moment too long. The security officer noticed. The royal protection officers noticed. Even the other staff members who were pretending not to watch noticed. The bag went through the scanner. The security officer looked at her screen. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She looked again, then pressed a button to stop the conveyor belt. Something in that scan didn't look quite right. It wasn't dangerous, nothing that would cause immediate alarm. But it was unusual enough that she needed to check it properly. She looked up at Queen Camilla and spoke politely but firmly. She would need to inspect the bag manually. It was standard procedure when something on the scan looked unclear. Most people understood this and cooperated without any problem. But Camilla's reaction was not what anyone expected. The color drained from her face. Her hand reached out toward the bag as if she wanted to grab it back. She opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. For a woman who had spent decades in the public eye, who had faced criticism and cameras and difficult situations with grace, this moment of visible panic was shocking. The royal protection officers immediately stepped forward. Their job was to protect the queen consort, and they took that job very seriously. They began to explain to the security officer that perhaps this could be handled differently, that maybe they could vouch for the contents of the bag. But then something even more unexpected happened. Camilla raised her hand, stopping her own security team. Her voice was quiet but clear. She said something to the chief security officer that made him freeze. Whatever she whispered, it was serious enough that his expression changed completely. He immediately reached for his radio and spoke in code words that the regular staff couldn't understand. Within seconds, a more senior security official arrived. There was a brief hushed conversation. Camilla's face had gone from pale to slightly red. She looked embarrassed, worried, and determined all at once. The senior official nodded and gestured toward a private room off to the side of the terminal. As Camilla was led toward the private screening room, her small entourage followed. The regular security officer who had first spotted the issue on the scanner stood there, wondering what she had just uncovered. She had simply been doing her job, following the rules that applied to everyone who traveled through that airport. But now, as she watched the Queen Consort of Britain being escorted into a private room with security officials and royal protection officers surrounding her, she realized that this was no ordinary security check. Something big was happening, something that would probably be talked about for a long time to come. The door to the private room closed. Outside in the terminal, staff members tried to continue with their work, but everyone was distracted. Phones were being checked. Worried glances were being exchanged. And that worn leather handbag, which had seemed so unimportant just an hour ago, was now at the center of what was quickly becoming a very unusual situation. Nobody in that terminal, not the security staff, not the royal protection officers, not even Camilla's personal assistant who had been with her for years, could have guessed what was really inside that bag. And they definitely couldn't have predicted the chain of events that was about to unfold, events that would make headlines around the world and change how people viewed the Queen Consort forever. The private screening room was small but comfortable, designed for situations exactly like this. It had soft lighting, a table, a few chairs, and most importantly, complete privacy from the busy terminal outside. This was where celebrities, diplomats, and yes, even royals could be screened away from public eyes when something needed extra attention. Camilla sat down in one of the chairs, still holding that leather handbag on her lap. The senior security official, a man named David who had 20 years of experience in airport security, sat across from her. He had handled sensitive situations before, but never quite like this. Having a queen in front of him, clearly distressed about a bag inspection, was not something his training manual had covered in detail. Two royal protection officers stood near the door. They were torn between their duty to protect the queen and their understanding that airport security had its own rules that even royals had to follow. The female security officer who had first noticed the irregularity in the scan stood to the side, her tablet ready to document whatever was found. David spoke first, his voice calm and respectful. He explained that this was just a routine check, nothing to worry about. Whatever was in the bag, they simply needed to verify it for security purposes. He had given this same speech to countless travelers, though usually not to members of the royal family. Camilla nodded slowly. Her hands were shaking slightly as they rested on the handbag. She looked at the royal protection officers, then back at David. She asked a question that surprised everyone in the room. She wanted to know if whatever was discussed in this room could remain confidential. Could this be kept private? David hesitated. Airport security had protocols. There were rules about what needed to be reported and what could be kept quiet. But he also understood that some situations required discretion. He carefully explained that if there was nothing illegal or dangerous in the bag, then there was no reason this couldn't be handled privately. However, he still needed to see what had caused the unusual reading on the scanner. Taking a deep breath, Camilla slowly opened the handbag. Her fingers trembled as she reached inside. What she pulled out first was a bundle of letters, maybe 50 or 60 of them, all tied together with a faded pink ribbon. The envelopes were old, some yellowed with age. The handwriting on them was shaky, the kind of writing that comes from elderly hands or someone who is unwell. Everyone in the room leaned in slightly, trying to see without appearing too curious. David asked politely if he could look at one of the letters. Camilla hesitated, then nodded. She untied the ribbon with care as if the letters were made of glass that might break. She handed one envelope to David, but her eyes pleaded with him to be gentle with it. David opened the envelope carefully and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He began to read, and within seconds his professional expression softened. This wasn't anything dangerous or illegal. This was something deeply personal. The letter was written from a father to his daughter, talking about memories, about love, about things that only family would understand. But there was more in the bag. Camilla reached in again and pulled out an old mobile phone. Not a smartphone, but one of those basic phones from maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the kind that only made calls and sent simple text messages. David looked at it confused. Why would the Queen Consort be carrying such an old phone? The female security officer spoke up. She had noticed on the scanner that the phone appeared to have some kind of storage device in it. Maybe a memory card. She asked if the phone was currently active, if it was being used. Camilla nodded. She said she had been using it, but only for something very specific. Only for something she had wanted to keep private. David asked if he could turn the phone on. Camilla's face went pale again, but she agreed. She told him the passcode, a simple 4-digit number. When the phone lit up, David navigated to the messages. There were text messages, recent ones from just a few days ago. But what caught his attention more were the voice recordings stored on the phone. He looked at Camilla, asking permission with his eyes. She nodded, though tears were starting to form. David played one of the recordings. Through the small speaker came the sound of an elderly man's voice, weak and confused, talking about things that didn't quite make sense. Between the confused words, there were moments of clarity, moments where the voice said Camilla's name with love and recognition. David stopped the recording. He didn't need to hear more. He understood now what he was looking at. These weren't state secrets or scandalous materials. These were precious personal memories, the kind that money couldn't buy and that no amount of royal privilege could protect from the cruelty of time and illness. But protocol was protocol. David had to ask about the text messages. Who had Camilla been texting with this phone? Why was she using a phone that wasn't registered to the royal household? All royal communications were supposed to go through secure official channels. This phone represented a complete breach of that security protocol. Camilla wiped her eyes and explained. The messages were with her sister. They had been coordinating something she had wanted to do without the palace knowing. She wasn't trying to hide anything dangerous or wrong. She just wanted this one thing to remain hers, to remain private, without it becoming part of the official royal record. One of the royal protection officers shifted uncomfortably. He realized they had a serious problem. If this got out, if the media found out that Queen Camilla had been using an unregistered phone to communicate privately, it would cause a huge scandal. Security experts would have a field day. Questions would be asked in Parliament. The headlines would be brutal. David sat back in his chair thinking. He was just an airport security official. This situation had suddenly become much bigger than checking a bag for prohibited items. He was now sitting in a room with information that could potentially cause a national controversy. What was he supposed to do with that? The female security officer suggested they might need to contact someone higher up, maybe someone from the palace security team, or even from the government. This wasn't just about airport rules anymore. This was about royal protocol, national security, and things way above their pay grade. Camilla spoke up, her voice stronger now. She asked them to wait before calling anyone else. She wanted to explain everything, to tell them why she had these letters, why she had the phone, and where she had been planning to go. She said that if they understood the full story, they might see that this wasn't the scandal it appeared to be. But before she could explain further, David's radio crackled to life. His supervisor was asking for an update. Other staff members were getting curious about why the Queen had been in the private screening room for so long. And outside the terminal, a photographer had noticed that something unusual was happening. He couldn't see into the private room, but he could see the unusual activity. The worried faces of staff members, the way people were whispering. David looked at Camilla, then at the royal protection officers. He made a decision. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had only ever used twice before in his entire career. It was the direct line to the head of airport security, someone who had clearance to handle situations involving national security and high-profile individuals. As the phone rang, everyone in the room held their breath. The royal protection officers moved closer to Camilla, instinctively protective. The female security officer clutched her tablet, knowing that whatever happened next would need to be carefully documented. And Camilla sat quietly, holding those precious letters and that old phone, waiting to see how her secret would unravel. Outside the room, the normal sounds of the airport continued. Planes took off and landed. Travelers rushed to their gates. Announcements echoed through the terminals. But inside that small private screening room, time seemed to stand still as everyone waited to see what would happen when the carefully controlled world of royal protocol collided with the messy, human need for privacy and personal memory. Richard's phone call set off a chain reaction that rippled through the highest levels of British authority, faster than anyone could have imagined. Within 3 minutes of his call, the palace's head of security was on the line. Within 5 minutes, the king's private secretary had been pulled out of a meeting. Within 10 minutes, King Charles himself was being briefed on what was happening at Heathrow Airport. Back in the screening room, Camilla could sense the machinery starting to move. She had lived in the royal world long enough to know how these things worked. Once something was flagged as potentially sensitive, protocols kicked in automatically. People started making calls. Departments started coordinating. The normal world stopped and the official world took over. Richard came back into the room, his face showing the strain of the conversation he had just had. He informed Camilla that the private terminal was now under what they called a soft lockdown. Nobody would be allowed in or out until the situation was resolved. The regular passengers in the main terminal wouldn't notice anything, but in the VIP area everything had stopped. Camilla's scheduled flight to Scotland was obviously not happening. Her small entourage was being kept in a separate waiting area, confused and worried. They knew something had gone wrong, but nobody was telling them what. The pilots of her plane were waiting, unaware of the drama unfolding in the terminal below them. Then came the news that made everyone in the room straighten up. King Charles was coming to Heathrow. He had immediately canceled his afternoon engagements and was already in the royal helicopter heading their way. The estimated arrival time was less than 20 minutes. Camilla's reaction to this news surprised everyone. Instead of looking worried or upset, she actually smiled sadly. She said something that made the tension in the room shift slightly. She said Charles already knew about the letters. He had always known how much she had struggled with her father's illness and death. What he didn't know about was the phone and the secret trip to the charity. The royal protection officers exchanged looks. If the king already knew about the letters, then maybe this wasn't going to be the huge scandal they had feared. Maybe this was more of a family matter that had accidentally become a security matter. While they waited for the king to arrive, Richard asked Camilla if she would mind if he contacted the charity she had been planning to visit. He wanted to verify that her story checked out, that there really was a charity expecting some kind of donation related to dementia research. Camilla gave him the details, including the name of the person she had been coordinating with, her sister Annabelle. Richard made the call from the room, putting it on speaker so everyone could hear. A woman answered, giving her name as the charity's director. Richard carefully explained who he was and that he needed to verify some information about a potential donation. The woman's voice immediately became cautious. She asked what this was about. Richard looked at Camilla, who nodded permission for him to explain. He told the charity director that he was calling about a donation of personal letters and recordings related to dementia, materials that had been meant to arrive today. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the charity director confirmed everything Camilla had said. She explained that they had been working with Annabelle to arrange this donation. The materials were going to be used in a research project studying how families communicated with loved ones suffering from dementia. The personal letters and voice recordings from someone of Camilla's background would be incredibly valuable, not because of who she was, but because they showed the disease affected everyone regardless of wealth or status. She added that they had been promised complete anonymity. The letters would be studied by researchers, but the identity of the family would never be revealed publicly. It was meant to be a quiet, private contribution to science and to helping other families. Richard thanked her and ended the call. At least that part of the story checked out. Camilla had been telling the truth about her intentions. This really was about honoring her father and helping others, not about anything scandalous or wrong. But there was still the issue of the security breach. The unregistered phone, the secret communications, the plan to travel without fully informing her protection team. These were real problems that couldn't just be ignored, even if the motivations behind them were completely innocent and even admirable. The female security officer asked a question that had been bothering her. She wanted to know if anyone had done a technical scan of the phone to make sure it hadn't been compromised. If Camilla had been using this phone for private communications, was it possible that someone else had gained access to it? Could there be malware or spyware on it? That thought sent a chill through the room. Nobody had checked that. They had been so focused on what was on the phone that they hadn't thought about whether the phone itself was secure. Richard immediately called for a technical security expert to be brought to the terminal. They needed to know if this phone represented an active security threat. While they waited, Camilla made a request. She wanted to call her sister. Annabelle would be worried sick when Camilla didn't arrive as planned. She needed to let her know what had happened. Richard hesitated, then agreed, but said the call would need to be monitored and made on an official royal phone, not the old mobile. The call was brief and emotional. Camilla explained that there had been a complication at the airport, that their plan had been discovered and that Charles was on his way. Her sister's voice came through clearly, worried and apologetic. She felt responsible for encouraging Camilla to do this secretly. Camilla assured her it wasn't her fault, that she had made her own choices and would face whatever consequences came. After the call ended, Camilla sat quietly. The Royal Protection officers could see she was tired. This whole situation had taken an emotional toll. She wasn't just dealing with security protocols and official procedures. She was reliving the grief of losing her father, the frustration of feeling like she couldn't even grieve in private, and now the embarrassment of having her personal plans exposed. The door opened and a technical specialist arrived with equipment to analyze the phone. He was given a quick briefing and set to work. Everyone watched as he connected the old mobile to his laptop and started running scans. The process took about 10 minutes. 10 very quiet minutes where the only sound was the clicking of keyboard keys and the occasional beep from the security equipment. Finally, the specialist looked up. He had good news and bad news. The good news was that the phone hadn't been hacked or compromised. There was no evidence of any malware or outside access. The bad news was that the phone's security was so weak that it could have been easily compromised if anyone had tried. Camilla had been lucky that nobody had thought to target this old device. Just as the specialist finished his report, there was a commotion outside the room. The sound of additional security personnel arriving, voices giving commands, the efficient bustle that always accompanied royal movements. King Charles had arrived at Heathrow. Richard stood up, straightening his uniform. The Royal Protection officers moved to positions on either side of the door. The security staff tried to look professional despite the unusual circumstances, and Camilla remained seated, her hands folded over those precious letters, waiting to face her husband and explain why she had tried to keep this one secret. The door opened, and King Charles walked in. His face was difficult to read, a mixture of concern, frustration, and something else that might have been understanding. He looked around the room at all the official personnel, then his eyes settled on Camilla and the old leather handbag sitting beside her. He spoke one sentence that changed the entire atmosphere in the room. He said he wished she had told him she was ready to donate the letters. He would have helped her do it properly, without all this secrecy and stress. His voice wasn't angry. It was just sad. The sadness of a husband who realized his wife hadn't felt she could trust him with something so important to her. The head of airport security arrived within 15 minutes. His name was Richard, a former military man who had spent the last decade making sure Heathrow ran smoothly and safely. He had dealt with bomb threats, unruly passengers, and even a few minor diplomatic incidents. But as he walked toward the private screening room, he knew this was going to be different. This was the Queen Consort. When Richard entered the room, everyone stood up instinctively except Camilla, who simply nodded at him. He could see immediately that this wasn't a criminal situation. The atmosphere in the room was tense, yes, but it wasn't the kind of tension that came with danger. It was the tension of something deeply personal being exposed when it was meant to stay hidden. David quickly briefed Richard on what they had found. The letters, the phone, the voice recordings, the text messages. As he spoke, Richard's expression changed from official concern to something softer, something more human. He looked at the bundle of letters on the table, at the old phone sitting next to them, and then at Camilla's face. which showed a mixture of embarrassment and determination. Richard asked the question that everyone was thinking. Why would the Queen Consort need to hide letters in an old phone? Why couldn't these things go through normal royal channels? What was she protecting and from whom? Camilla took a deep breath and began to tell her story. The letters, she explained, were from her father, Major Bruce Shand. He had written them during the last few years of his life, when his mind had started to fade because of dementia. Some of the letters were clear and beautiful, full of memories from her childhood, advice for her life, expressions of love from a father to his daughter. But others were confused, rambling, showing the cruel way that disease had stolen his sharp mind. Her voice cracked as she talked about watching her father forget who she was. There were days when he would recognize her and days when he would look at her like she was a stranger. The letters captured both versions of him, the brilliant military man he had been and the confused elderly man he had become. After he passed away, Camilla had kept these letters private. They were too painful, too personal to share. The palace had archivists who wanted to document everything related to the royal family. They had asked for personal papers, photos, letters. It was all supposed to become part of the official historical record. But these letters, Camilla couldn't bear the thought of strangers reading them, analyzing them, putting them in boxes in some royal archive. Richard listened carefully, nodding. He could understand that. But what about the phone? Why the secret phone with the voice recordings and text messages? Camilla explained that a few years ago, before her father died, she had started recording their conversations. Not all of them. Just the good moments. The times when his mind was clear and he was really her father again. She would record him telling old stories, singing songs from his military days, or just saying her name with that special warmth that only a loving parent has. She had kept these recordings on that old phone because she didn't want them on her official phone, the one that palace staff had access to, the one that was backed up to royal servers, the one that could be subpoenaed if there was ever any kind of investigation or historical inquiry. She wanted these memories to be completely hers, completely private. The text messages were with her sister Annabelle. They had been planning something together, something that Camilla had wanted to do for months but hadn't been able to figure out how to do it, without the palace finding out and potentially stopping her. She wanted to donate these letters and recordings to a dementia research charity to help with a project that collected family stories to better understand how the disease affected not just patients but their families too. But here was the problem. If she went through official channels, there would be committees, discussions, approvals needed from various palace departments. There would be questions about whether these materials were private or part of the royal historical record. Lawyers would get involved. It could take months or even years, and Camilla felt like if she waited, if she let the palace machinery grind through its processes, she might lose her courage to share something so painful. So she had decided to do it quietly, privately. She would take the letters and the phone to Scotland where the charity was based. She would hand them over personally, without fanfare, without press releases, without any of the usual royal ceremony. Just one daughter honoring her father's memory by trying to help other families going through the same terrible experience. As Camilla finished her explanation, there was silence in the room. Everyone was processing what they had just heard. This wasn't a scandal about hidden affairs or secret political dealings. This was about grief, about a daughter trying to hold on to her father's memory while also trying to use that pain to help others. But Richard, despite his sympathy, had a job to do. He gently pointed out the problems with what Camilla had planned. Using an unregistered phone was a serious security breach. Royal communications were monitored not because anyone wanted to spy on personal matters, but because there were real threats out there. People who might try to intercept messages, to hack phones, to use any information they could find. By using this old phone, Camilla had potentially made herself vulnerable. And more than that, she had made the palace vulnerable. If someone had managed to hack that phone, if they had gotten access to those text messages with her sister, they could have potentially used that information in harmful ways. One of the royal protection officers added another concern. By planning to travel with these materials without telling anyone, Camilla had also created a security risk in another way. Her protection team needed to know where she was going and why. If something had happened, If there had been any kind of incident, they wouldn't have had all the information they needed to protect her properly. Camilla's face showed that she understood these points. She admitted she hadn't thought about all of that. She had just been so focused on keeping this one thing private, on having this one piece of her life that wasn't managed and controlled and official. She was the queen consort, yes, but she was also still a daughter who missed her father and wanted to honor his memory in her own way. The female security officer, who had been quiet for most of this conversation, spoke up with a practical question. What were they going to do now? This situation had already involved too many people to be kept completely quiet. The security staff who had been on duty, the supervisors who had been called the Royal Protection Team, they all knew something unusual had happened. How were they going to handle this? Richard pulled out his phone. He said they needed to contact the palace immediately. This was beyond his authority to handle alone. The king himself would need to be informed. Whatever happened next, it couldn't be decided by airport security officials and royal protection officers in a private screening room. Camilla closed her eyes for a moment, accepting what was coming. She had known, really, that her plan wouldn't work. Part of her had probably always known that. But she had hoped, desperately hoped, that she could have this one thing that was just hers. Richard stepped outside to make his call. Through the door, the others could hear his low voice speaking in serious tones. The royal protection officers exchanged glances, already mentally preparing for the media storm that might be coming. The security staff wondered if they had done the right thing, or if they should have just let the queen consort pass through without all this scrutiny. And Camilla sat there, carefully retying the pink ribbon around her father's letters, her fingers gentle and loving on the old paper. Whatever was about to happen, whatever consequences were coming, at least these letters were still with her. At least she still had her father's words, even if she couldn't keep them private the way she had wanted to. While King Charles and Camilla spoke privately in the screening room, the outside world was starting to notice that something unusual was happening. It started small, the way these things always do. A staff member at the airport mentioned to a friend that Queen Camilla had been held up at security. That friend mentioned it to someone else, and that someone else happened to work part-time as a freelance photographer. The photographer made a phone call to a journalist he sometimes worked with at one of London's biggest tabloid newspapers. He didn't have many details, just that there had been some kind of security situation involving the queen consort at Heathrow, and that she was still at the airport hours after she was supposed to have left. It was thin information, but in the world of royal news, even thin information was worth investigating. The journalist, a woman who had been covering the royal family for almost 20 years, knew that something about this story didn't add up. Queen Camilla's trips were usually announced in advance. The palace was very good at managing these things. But when she checked the official royal schedule, there was nothing listed about a trip to Scotland. When she called her contacts at the palace press office, she got vague responses about the queen consort's private schedule. That vagueness only made her more interested. She sent a junior reporter to Heathrow to see what he could find out. She also started making calls to her sources, people who worked in and around the palace, people who usually knew when something was happening. At the airport, the junior reporter arrived at the private terminal and immediately noticed the unusual security presence. There were more protection officers than normal, more serious-looking people talking into radios and phones. He started taking photos from a distance, being careful not to get too close and get himself removed from the area. One of his photos captured something interesting. Through a window, partially obscured by blinds, he managed to get a shot that showed what looked like official security equipment, the kind used for analyzing electronic devices. It wasn't clear what was going on, but it suggested this wasn't just a routine travel delay. Back at the newspaper office, the photos landed on the journalist's desk. She studied them carefully, her experienced eye picking up details that others might miss. She made a decision to reach out directly to the palace press office again, this time with a more direct question. She wanted to know if there had been any kind of security incident involving Queen Camilla. The press officer's response was carefully worded. He confirmed that Queen Camilla's travel schedule had been adjusted due to unforeseen circumstances. He said there was no cause for concern and that everything was being handled appropriately. He would not provide any additional details at this time. That response was enough to confirm that there was definitely a story here. The journalist started writing, being careful to stick to facts she could verify. She reported that Queen Camilla had been delayed at Heathrow Airport due to what sources described as a security matter. She noted that the palace was being unusually tight-lipped about the details. She mentioned that King Charles had unexpectedly cancelled his afternoon engagements and had been seen departing in the royal helicopter. The story went online first, as these things do in the modern age. Within minutes, it was being shared on social media. Royal watchers around the world started speculating about what could have happened. The theories ranged from reasonable to ridiculous. Some thought there might have been a security threat at the airport. Others wondered if Camilla had been taken ill. A few conspiracy theorists suggested it might be related to some kind of political drama. Other news organizations picked up the story. Television news channels started running it as a breaking news item, even though they had very few actual facts to report. Reporters stood outside Buckingham Palace, outside Heathrow Airport, speaking to cameras and essentially reporting that something had happened, but nobody knew exactly what. Inside the palace, the press office was being overwhelmed with calls. Journalists from around the world wanted details. Every news organization that covered the royals wanted to know what was going on. The press secretary held an emergency meeting with his team to decide how to handle the situation. They faced a difficult choice. They could say nothing and let speculation run wild, which would probably result in worse stories than the truth. Or they could try to get ahead of the story by providing some controlled information. But what could they say? The truth was complicated and deeply personal. It involved mental illness, family grief, and security protocols. It wasn't something that could be explained in a simple press statement. Meanwhile, social media was exploding with theories and rumors. The hashtag about Queen Camilla started trending on Twitter. People were sharing the photos from the airport, analyzing them frame by frame. Amateur royal experts were giving their opinions on news shows. Everyone had a theory, and very few of them were anywhere close to the truth. Some of the speculation was relatively harmless. People wondered if there had been a problem with travel documents or if there had been some kind of miscommunication about the trip. But other theories were more troubling. There were suggestions of serious illness, of family emergencies, of conflicts within the royal family. Some people even speculated about whether this might be related to some kind of scandal or controversy. The worst part was that every hour the palace stayed silent. The speculation got worse. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the information vacuum around this story was being filled with increasingly wild theories. Royal commentators who should have known better were appearing on television to discuss what might have happened, even though they had no real information. At Heathrow, the staff who had been involved in the situation were under strict orders not to speak to anyone about what they had seen. The airport's management was taking this very seriously. Anyone caught leaking information would face immediate dismissal. But the order itself became a story. Journalists found out that airport staff had been told to sign additional confidentiality agreements, which only fueled speculation about how serious this matter was. Camilla's sister, Annabelle, was at home watching the news in horror. She saw her sister's photo on every channel, heard reporters speculating about what had happened. She felt terribly guilty. This had been partly her idea, encouraging Camilla to make the donation, to do something private and personal. Now it had turned into a public spectacle. She tried calling Camilla's official phone but couldn't get through. She tried calling the palace but was told politely that no information was available. She was left to watch the media circus unfold, knowing the truth but unable to say anything about it. Back at Heathrow, inside that small screening room, Camilla and Charles were aware that the story had broken. They had been shown some of the news coverage. Camilla looked devastated. All she had wanted was to do something quiet and private in memory of her father. Instead, it had become exactly the kind of public drama she had been trying to avoid. Charles was frustrated too, but his frustration was directed at the situation, not at his wife. He understood why she had wanted to keep this private. He understood the pressure she felt, the constant awareness that everything she did became public property. He was angry at himself for not creating an environment where she had felt safe to tell him about her plans. The palace press secretary called Charles directly. They needed to make a decision about what to say to the media. The story was growing by the hour and silence was no longer an option. They needed to either confirm something or deny something or provide some kind of context that would calm the speculation. Charles made a decision. They would need to tell the truth, or at least enough of the truth to stop the harmful speculation. But first, he needed to get Camilla back to the palace safely. The last thing they needed was for her to have to face a crowd of reporters at the airport. Plans were quickly made to move both the king and queen consort back to the palace via a secure route that would avoid the press that was now gathering at the airport. The letters and the phone would come with them, still evidence of what had started this whole situation. As they prepared to leave the screening room, Camilla took one last look at the space where her private pain had become a public matter. She carefully placed the letters back in the old leather handbag and clutched it close. Whatever happened next, whatever the palace decided to say, whatever the press wrote about her, at least she still had these. At least she still had her father's words. Outside, camera crews were setting up, reporters were going live, and the world was waiting to find out what had really happened at Heathrow Airport that day. Nobody knew yet that what they were about to learn would change how many people viewed the royal family, and especially Queen Camilla, forever. The palace decided to wait 48 hours before making any public statement. Those 2 days were among the most stressful that the royal press office had experienced in years. The media speculation continued to grow. Royal experts appeared on every news channel, each with their own theory about what had happened. Social media was full of wild rumors. The silence from the palace only made everything worse. During those 48 hours, intensive discussions were happening behind closed doors. Charles and Camilla met with the palace's senior advisors, legal experts, and communications specialists. They had to decide exactly how much to reveal and how to frame the story in a way that was truthful, but also protected the family's privacy as much as possible. Camilla had initially wanted to say nothing at all. She felt that the whole situation was deeply personal and none of the public's business. But the advisors explained that the speculation was getting out of control. Some news outlets were reporting rumors about serious illness, others about financial scandals, and a few were even suggesting there might be some kind of rift within the royal family. The truth, they argued, was actually much less damaging than what people were imagining. Charles supported his wife but also agreed with the advisors. He had lived through enough media storms to know that silence rarely made things better. People would fill the void with their own stories, and those stories were often worse than reality. There was another consideration, too. The security breach, the unregistered phone, the private communications. These were real issues that couldn't just be swept under the carpet. Parliament would want answers. Security services would want to review protocols. This wasn't something that could be handled with a simple press release saying everything was fine. Finally, they made a decision. Camilla herself would make a statement. Not a written statement read by a press secretary, but a personal appearance where she would explain in her own words what had happened and why. It would be unprecedented for a queen consort to address a potential scandal so directly, but these were unprecedented circumstances. The press conference was scheduled for 2 days after the incident. It would take place in one of the palace's formal rooms, not the usual press briefing room. The palace wanted this to feel personal and sincere, not like a corporate damage control exercise. On the morning of the press conference, Camilla barely slept. She had spent the night before going over her statement, changing words, trying to find the right balance between explaining herself and not revealing so much that every detail of her father's illness became public property. Charles sat with her that morning over breakfast. They didn't talk much about what was coming. Instead, they talked about her father, about the good memories, about the kind of man he had been before the disease took his mind. It was those memories, Charles reminded her, that she was trying to honor. That's what people needed to understand. When the time came, Camilla walked into the room where dozens of reporters and cameras were waiting. She was wearing a simple dark blue suit, no elaborate jewelry, no royal regalia. She wanted to look like a daughter talking about her father, not a queen making a formal pronouncement. The room fell silent as she took her position behind a podium. She had notes with her, but she barely looked at them. This was something she needed to say from her heart. She started by acknowledging the speculation and worry her situation had caused. She apologized for the concern people had felt. Then she began to tell her story. She spoke about her father with such love and warmth that several of the hardened journalists in the room found themselves getting emotional. She described him as a military man, strong and decisive, someone who had always been there to guide her. She talked about how devastating it had been to watch dementia slowly steal that strong man away, replacing him with someone who was confused and frightened. The letters, she explained, were precious to her because they were written during that in-between time, when her father was losing himself but still having moments of clarity. In those letters, she could still find the father she had known. They were her connection to him, her proof that even as the disease took so much, his love for her had remained. She talked about the voice recordings on the old phone, how she would sometimes listen to them late at night when she missed her father most. She admitted that keeping them on a separate phone had been wrong from a security standpoint, but it had felt necessary for her emotional survival. She needed to know that somewhere she had something that was completely private, completely hers. Then she addressed the real reason she had been trying to travel that day. She explained about the dementia research charity, about their project collecting family stories to help understand the human side of the disease. She wanted to donate her father's letters and those voice recordings to help other families, to contribute to research that might someday help find better treatments or even a cure. But she had been afraid. She admitted that if she went through official channels, the process would take too long. She worried that palace protocols would require the letters to be archived first, studied by historians, that their personal nature would be lost in bureaucracy. She wanted them to go directly to where they could do good, where they could help people who were suffering the way her family had suffered. She acknowledged that trying to do this secretly had been a mistake. She understood now that security protocols existed for good reasons. She apologized to her protection team for putting them in a difficult position, and to the airport security staff for causing such a complicated situation. Her voice broke when she talked about how much she had just wanted one thing in her life to remain private. She spoke about the difficulty of living in a world where every action was recorded, every word analyzed, every personal moment potentially turned into a public story. She wasn't complaining about her role, she was quick to add. She had chosen this life and accepted its responsibilities. But sometimes, the weight of being constantly public became almost too much to bear. She finished by saying that she hoped people could understand that even those who live very public lives have moments of private grief, private memories, private wishes. The letters would still be donated to the charity, she said, but now it would be done openly with proper protocols followed. She hoped that by sharing this story, she might help reduce the stigma around dementia and encourage other families to talk about their experiences with the disease. When she finished speaking, there was a long moment of silence in the room. Then slowly questions began. But the tone of the questions was different from what anyone had expected. Instead of the aggressive, probing questions that often came in these situations, the reporters asked respectful, even sympathetic questions. They asked about dementia care, about how she had coped with watching her father's decline, about what message she wanted to send to other families dealing with the disease. A few questions touched on the security issues, but even those were asked gently, acknowledging that mistakes had been made but focusing more on what had motivated those mistakes. One journalist, a woman who had covered the royals for 30 years, asked a question that brought tears to Camilla's eyes. She asked if Camilla's father had known in his clear moments how much his daughter loved him. Camilla nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she found her voice, she said yes, he had known. That was what the letters proved to her. Even when his mind was failing, he had remembered her love and had tried to express his own. The press conference lasted about 45 minutes. When it ended, Camilla left the room looking exhausted but also somehow lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. She had told her truth. She had exposed something deeply personal, yes, but on her own terms, in her own words. Charles was waiting for her outside the room. He didn't say anything, just took her hand and squeezed it. They walked together back to their private apartments, leaving the press team to handle the follow-up questions and the logistics of the story that would now dominate the news cycle for days to come. In the press room, journalists were already filing their stories, but the tone of those stories was remarkably different from the speculation that had filled the previous 2 days. Instead of scandal and drama, they were writing about grief, love, and the very human struggle to maintain privacy in an increasingly public world. The revelation, it turned out, was not what anyone had expected. There was no scandal, no controversy, no dramatic rift or hidden secret that threatened the monarchy. There was just a daughter who had loved her father, who missed him terribly and who had made a mistake in trying to honor his memory, while also trying to help others. It was the most human of stories, and that humanity was what would resonate with millions of people around the world. The response to Camilla's press conference was unlike anything the palace had seen in years. Within hours, the story had gone from being treated as a potential scandal to becoming something entirely different. A moment of genuine human connection between the royal family and ordinary people. Social media, which had been full of wild speculation just days before, suddenly filled with messages of support and sympathy. People shared their own stories of watching parents and grandparents struggle with dementia. They talked about the pain of seeing someone you love slowly forget who you are. They expressed understanding for why Camilla had wanted to keep something so personal private. The hashtag that had been used to spread rumors now became a space for people to share their experiences with the disease. Within 24 hours, thousands of people had posted about their own family members who had suffered from dementia. They thanked Camilla for bringing attention to an issue that affected so many families, but was still often hidden away, treated as something shameful rather than a medical condition deserving of research and support. Dementia charities across Britain reported an immediate surge in donations. Their phone lines were overwhelmed with people calling to ask how they could help, how they could volunteer, how they could contribute to research. The charity that Camilla had originally planned to donate the letters to received so many calls that they had to set up a special hotline just to handle the volume. But the reaction wasn't universally positive. Some people, particularly those who took royal protocol very seriously, were critical of how Camilla had handled the situation. They argued that someone in her position couldn't just bypass security measures because of personal feelings. They pointed out that the unregistered phone represented a real security risk, regardless of why she had been using it. Conservative members of Parliament raised questions in the House of Commons. They wanted to know what measures were being taken to ensure this kind of security breach didn't happen again. They asked whether other members of the royal family might be using private communication devices that weren't properly monitored. The questions weren't aggressive, but they were serious. Security wasn't something that could be set aside, even for the most sympathetic reasons. The palace security team conducted a full review of all royal communication devices and protocols. They found no other instances of unofficial phones or unmonitored communications, but they did update their procedures to make it clearer how personal items should be handled while still respecting reasonable privacy. Constitutional. Experts debated whether this incident revealed a deeper problem with how the modern monarchy balanced public duty with personal privacy. Some argued that the royal family deserved more space for private life. Others maintained that accepting a royal role meant accepting that almost everything about your life would be public in some way. News programs interviewed doctors and researchers who specialized in dementia care. They talked about how common it was for families to struggle with the disease, how it affected millions of people worldwide, how desperately more research funding was needed. They praised Camilla for using her experience to highlight these issues, even if the way it had come to light wasn't what anyone had planned. The international reaction was mixed. In some countries, people admired Camilla's honesty and vulnerability. They saw her press conference as a refreshing change from the usual carefully managed royal appearances. In other places, particularly where monarchies were viewed with skepticism, critics argued that this was just another example of royals thinking rules didn't apply to them. But perhaps the most powerful reactions came from ordinary people who had been through similar experiences. Letters started arriving at the palace, thousands of them, from people who wanted to share their own stories. A man wrote about recording his mother's voice before Alzheimer's took her ability to speak, and how those recordings were now his most treasured possession. A woman described keeping her father's confused but loving letters in a special box, unable to throw them away even years after his death. These weren't people who usually paid much attention to the royal family. Many of them admitted they had never been particularly interested in royal news. But Camilla's story had touched something in them. It had reminded them that grief was grief, loss was loss, regardless of whether you lived in a palace or a small apartment. Schools started using the incident as a teaching moment about dementia, about mental health, about the importance of talking openly about difficult things. Teachers reported that students were more willing to discuss their own family experiences with illness and loss after hearing about Camilla's situation The charity that was supposed to receive the letters made an announcement. They would be creating a new program called the Family Voices Project, specifically designed to collect and preserve personal stories from families affected by dementia. They emphasized that all contributions would be kept confidential unless families chose to make them public. The program would use these real experiences to train healthcare workers, to help researchers understand the disease better, and to support other families going through similar struggles. The response to this announcement was overwhelming. Within a week, they had received offers of donations from hundreds of families. Some wanted to give letters, others had video recordings or diaries. Each one represented a personal story of love and loss, similar to Camilla's but unique in its own way. However, not everyone was comfortable with how public this had all become. Some people in Camilla's own circle, friends and family members, felt that she had been forced to share too much. They worried that the intimate details of her father's illness had been exposed to public scrutiny in a way that wasn't fair to his memory. Her sister Annabelle was particularly conflicted. She was glad the truth had come out and that it had sparked such positive conversations, but she also felt guilty for encouraging the secret trip that had led to all of this. Royal commentators who had spent years criticizing Camilla found themselves having to re-evaluate their positions. One prominent critic, a journalist who had written harshly about her for decades, published a column admitting that he had never considered the human cost of constant public scrutiny. He didn't become a fan, but he acknowledged that what had happened at the airport revealed a side of royal life that deserved more understanding. The palace press office reported that media coverage of the royal family had shifted noticeably after the incident. There were more stories about the charitable work royals did, more interest in the causes they supported, and less focus on gossip and speculation. It was as if Camilla's moment of vulnerability had reminded everyone that these were real people dealing with real problems, not just characters in an ongoing soap opera. King Charles gave his own brief statement supporting his wife and thanking the public for their kindness. He also used the moment to announce that he would be becoming a patron of several dementia research organizations, committing to using his platform to raise awareness and funding for research into treatments and, hopefully, eventually a cure. 3 weeks after the airport incident, public opinion polls showed a dramatic shift in how people viewed Queen Camilla. Before the incident, she had been a somewhat controversial figure, with mixed approval ratings. After her press conference and the subsequent reaction, her approval ratings had jumped significantly. More importantly, the nature of how people talked about her had changed. Instead of focusing on her past or on protocol questions, people were talking about her as a real person who had experienced real loss. The incident had transformed her public image in a way that years of carefully managed royal appearances had never achieved. Sometimes, it seemed, the most powerful moments weren't the planned ones. Sometimes truth, even messy, complicated truth, connected with people more deeply than any amount of careful image management ever could. But questions remained. Had the palace handled this correctly? Should Camilla have been allowed more privacy from the start? Were security protocols too strict or not strict enough? How should royals balance their public responsibilities with their need for personal space? These weren't questions with easy answers, and the debate continued in newspapers, on television, and in homes across the country. What was clear was that something had shifted. The airport incident, which could have been a disaster, had somehow become a turning point. It had opened up conversations about grief, about privacy, about mental health, and about what it means to be human even when you're expected to be royal. The impact of those conversations would continue long after the immediate drama had faded from the headlines. 3 weeks after the airport incident, on a crisp autumn morning, Queen Camilla returned to complete the journey she had started. But this time everything was different. This time there was no secrecy, no hidden phone, no worn leather handbag clutched protectively to her chest. This time King Charles was by her side, and the world was watching. The Dementia Research Center in Scotland had prepared for their arrival. The small facility, normally a quiet place where researchers worked away from public attention, was now filled with cameras, reporters, and security personnel. The director of the center, a woman who had dedicated her entire career to understanding and fighting this terrible disease, stood nervously at the entrance waiting to greet them. When the royal car pulled up, Camilla stepped out looking calm and composed. She was wearing a warm coat against the Scottish chill, and she smiled genuinely at the small crowd that had gathered. These weren't royal watchers or professional photographers. They were families affected by dementia, researchers who worked on finding treatments, and volunteers who helped care for patients. They had come to witness what felt like an important moment. Charles walked beside his wife, his presence a clear message of support. He had insisted on coming, wanting to show that he stood with her, that what she was doing mattered. The palace had initially suggested he might want to distance himself slightly from the situation, given the security concerns it had raised. But Charles had rejected that advice. This was about family, about love, about doing something meaningful. He wasn't going to let protocol or politics get in the way. Inside the research center, the director gave them a tour. She showed them the laboratories where scientists studied brain tissue samples, trying to understand what caused neurons to die. She showed them the interview rooms where researchers talked to families, documenting the progression of the disease from a human perspective. She explained that their work combined cutting-edge medical science with deeply personal stories, because understanding dementia required both approaches. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. In a quiet office, away from most of the cameras, Camilla handed over the letters and the recordings. The director accepted them with visible emotion, understanding the trust being placed in her hands. These weren't just research materials. They were pieces of someone's heart, memories of a father who was gone but still deeply loved. Camilla had prepared a short speech for the formal part of the visit. She talked about how dementia didn't discriminate, how it affected families from all backgrounds. She emphasized that her father's military rank and her own position hadn't protected them from the pain of watching someone they loved disappear gradually. She hoped that by sharing their story, other families might feel less alone, might feel more comfortable talking about their own experiences. She announced that she would be establishing a new fund specifically for dementia research. She was personally contributing money, but more importantly, she was using her platform to encourage others to support this work. She wanted her father's legacy to be more than just memories. She wanted it to be hope for future families who wouldn't have to watch this disease take their loved ones. Charles added his own comments, praising the researchers and caregivers who dealt with dementia every day. He announced his new patronages and committed to making dementia research a priority during his reign. It was clear that what had started as Camilla's personal mission had become a cause that both of them would champion together. After the formal proceedings, something unexpected happened. The director asked if Camilla would be willing to meet with some of the families who had gathered outside. Camilla agreed immediately, and for the next hour she talked with people whose loved ones were living with dementia. She listened to their stories, shared tears with them, and offered comfort not as a queen but as someone who had been exactly where they were. One elderly man told her about his wife of 50 years, who now couldn't remember his name most days. Camilla held his hand and told him about the day her father had looked at her with confusion, asking who she was. They cried together, two people from completely different worlds connected by the same terrible loss. A young woman talked about her mother's early onset dementia, diagnosed at age 55. She was terrified, angry at the unfairness of it, struggling to be a caregiver while also dealing with her own grief. Camilla told her that all those feelings were valid, that being angry didn't mean you loved your mother any less, that sometimes the hardest part of this disease was that you had to grieve while the person was still alive. These conversations weren't recorded. There were no cameras in the room. This was genuine human connection, the kind that couldn't be staged or managed. It was what Camilla had been trying to protect when she attempted her secret trip, this authentic emotional space. But now she was finding it in public, discovering that vulnerability could create connection rather than weakness. By the end of the visit, everyone involved felt that something important had happened. The research center had received the donations they needed, yes, but more than that, they had gained a powerful advocate. The families who had met Camilla felt seen and understood in a way they hadn't expected. And Camilla herself seemed different, lighter somehow, as if finally being able to talk openly about her grief had lifted a burden she had been carrying for too long. On the drive back to the airport, the real airport this time with no security incidents, Charles and Camilla talked quietly about the day. Charles told her he was proud of her, not just for what she had done today, but for how she had handled the entire difficult situation. Camilla admitted that while she wished the airport incident had never happened, she was grateful for where it had led. Sometimes, she said, the worst moments opened doors to the best outcomes. Back at the palace, the staff noticed a change in the queen consort. She seemed more relaxed, more willing to be herself rather than always playing a role. The worn leather handbag that had caused so much drama was now displayed in her private study, a reminder of her father and of the unexpected journey that had come from trying to honor his memory. The palace also made some changes. New protocols were put in place that gave royals more explicit personal space, while still maintaining necessary security. There were clearer guidelines about what was private and what was public, better communication between the royal family and their security teams. The airport incident had revealed gaps in the system, and those gaps were being addressed. Several months later, the research center published their first findings from the Family Voices project. The response from the medical community was enthusiastic. Real stories from real families were providing insights that clinical studies alone couldn't capture. Camilla's father's letters were part of that research, though his identity remained protected as promised. His words, his confusion, his moments of clarity, all of it was helping doctors understand the disease better. The incident had also changed media coverage of the royal family in subtle but important ways. Journalists were more thoughtful about the line between public interest and personal privacy. There was more recognition that royals were human beings, who deserved some space for grief and personal struggle. It didn't stop all the gossip and speculation, nothing could do that, but it did shift the conversation somewhat. For Camilla personally, the whole experience had been transformative. She had learned that trying to keep everything private could sometimes cause more problems than being open. She had discovered that people could be kind and understanding when given the chance. And she had found that her pain, which she had tried so hard to hide, could actually help others when she was brave enough to share it. The worn leather handbag sat in her study, no longer secret, no longer hidden. Inside it, she kept new letters, ones from people who had written to thank her for speaking out, to share their own stories, to let her know that she had made a difference. Those letters were different from her father's, but they were precious in their own way. They were proof that sometimes our most private pains, when shared, could create the most powerful connections. King Charles would sometimes find her in the study, looking at the old handbag or reading the new letters. He would sit with her quietly, not saying much, just being there. They had learned something important through this whole situation. They had learned that even in their extraordinary lives, with all their privileges and responsibilities, they were still just people trying to honor the ones they had loved and lost. The airport incident that could have been a scandal, that could have damaged reputations and caused serious problems, had instead become a story about love, loss, and the very human need to remember. Years later, when people talked about Queen Camilla, they would often mention this moment, not because of the drama or the security breach, but because of what it revealed about the woman behind the title, the daughter who had loved her father so much that she had risked everything to honor his memory in her own way. And perhaps that was the real revelation all along. Not that royals could make mistakes or bypass protocols, but that underneath all the crowns and ceremonies and official duties, they were just people. People who grieved, people who struggled,